So with that, I would then like to formally welcome you to Kansas and to Kansas State University and to the United States of America. We've been working on this event for the past year, and it's very exciting now to see you here in person to officially kick off this event. To make this very official for our welcome, we have two special guests who would like to share some information about Kansas agriculture and Kansas State University. The first being our provost, Chuck Tabor, and he will be followed by the Assistant Secretary to the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Kelsey Olson. Provost Tabor.
Good morning. So on behalf of Kansas State University, I'm pleased to welcome the participants of the 9th Multi-Stakeholder Partnership Meeting of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock in Manhattan, Kansas. As the nation's first operational land-grant university, Kansas State University is committed to serving the state's 2.9 million residents, as well as solving global problems. The three-part mission of the land-grant university continues to evolve in the 21st century. What originally was described as teaching, research, and service has been renamed learning, discovery, and engagement. Livestock production in Kansas is the largest contributor to the agricultural industry, representing farmers, ranchers, and agribusiness across the state. K-State's expertise in the livestock and animal health sectors makes us uniquely qualified to host an engaging and informative multi-stakeholder partnership meeting. This meeting serves all of the missions of Kansas State University, and we're pleased to be hosting this meeting. K-State's College of Agriculture has 200 teaching faculty members across 9 departments, ranging from agricultural economics and animal sciences and industry to grain science and agronomy. Our campus research is enhanced through work at the Biosecurity Research Institute, the Beef Cattle Research Institute, the Food Science Institute, the Wheat Genomics Research Center, the O.H. Cruz Feed Technology Innovation Center, the Genetic Stock Center, the Center for Rural Enterprise Engagement, and the Center for Risk Management, Education, and Research. Additional research, educational, and technical facilities that support the agricultural industry and K-State research include the soon-to-be-completed, nations-only, Level 4 National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, the Bioprocessing Industrial Value-Added Program Facility, International Grains Program Institute, and the Extrusion Lab. In addition, our College of Veterinary Medicine is dedicated to the advancement of health and welfare of animals, people, the environment, and the veterinary profession through excellence in teaching, research, service, and outreach. K-State also has international initiatives that address important needs at a local, national, and global level. These include 4 USAID-funded Feed the Future Innovation Laboratories concentrated on sorghum and millet, wheat, reducing post-harvest loss, and sustainable intensification. Through these 4 labs alone, we have long-term activities in 18 different countries, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and in Latin America. Despite progress toward the goal of eradicating hunger worldwide, nearly 800 million people, that's 1 in 9, are food insecure. In the US, an estimated 14.3% of households, that's 17.5 million people, were food insecure at some time in 2013. We need to produce more food for the planet's growing population, and we need to do it in a sustainable way. By virtue of the broad subject matter expertise and global experience, universities are uniquely positioned to respond to the multidimensional issues that impact global food security. Historically, public and land-grant universities have been instrumental in solving food and agricultural challenges, both in the U.S. and overseas. But today's food security issues have grown in complexity. They are multidimensional, cross-disciplinary, multinational. They occur in conflict zones around the globe and in areas severely impacted by weather-related shocks. Systemic change, new funding patterns, innovations in public policy and governance, and unprecedented global partnerships are needed. The theme of this 9th multi-stakeholder meeting is innovation for sustainable livestock systems. Accomplishing sustainable livestock systems is a challenging task because of the complexity of the production systems, and will need a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives to succeed. I'm so pleased we have at this meeting representatives from academia, research institutions, private and public sector, intergovernmental and multilateral organizations, social movements, community-based organizations, donors, and livestock producers. The participants in this meeting have arrived from 22 different countries. With this diversity of thought, I'm convinced this group will have a successful meeting and will agree on some concrete actions that can be taken toward more sustainable livestock systems. Thank you for selecting K-State as host for this meeting. This will be a unique opportunity for our students, staff, and faculty to interact with such a committed and diverse group of stakeholders. Thank you, and have a great meeting.
Good morning and welcome. Kansas has a long, rich history of agriculture, dating back to our territorial days when cattle drives from Texas would end in just a town west of here called Abilene. Today, we continue to support agriculture as its largest industry, and the beef industry is one of our largest contributing to that industry. We have many things that help elaborate and make us a strong state in the terms of agriculture. We're the fastest growing dairy industry in terms of milk production, and we're home to the Animal Health Corridor, which hosts over 300 companies which promote agriculture and animal health in the state. We continue to be a contributor to the state and to the industry, and I believe that we will continue to do so as we discuss furthermore about sustainable livestock in the agriculture industry. In the last couple years, the industry-driven saw a need to propose a pilot program which talked about animal disease traceability. We hosted that in the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and we have multiple states that have joined in to track our animals as they go from development into the production into the food source. I hope that you guys will have great conversation today and this week, and we'll continue to find innovative ways to support the sustainability of livestock. It will have an impact not only in Kansas and in the United States, but around the world and all of the countries here as well. Thank you and enjoy the week.
Next, I'd like to share with you just a brief video that shares some highlights of Kansas agriculture. For many of you that may not have had the opportunity to visit Kansas before, this will just give you a snapshot of what the livestock systems looks like to us here in the Midwest. And after that, I would like to invite Bera Tukola from FAO and Fritz Snyder, Chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, to offer greetings and introductions, and will officially open the 9th Multi-Stakeholder Partnership Meeting.
Good morning, all. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations to address at this 9th multi-stakeholder platform meeting for the global agenda for sustainable livestock. But first, allow me to convey my vow of thanks to the government of US and particularly to the Kansas State University for hosting us and for the warm welcome. FAO has the mandate to build a world free from hunger and malnutrition. We have the great interest to strive towards achieving this goal, but growing pressures on natural resources and climate change are threatening the progress made so far. Achieving sustainable food and agriculture requires dialogue and cooperation between all stakeholders. Governments, private sector, non-governmental organizations, research and academia, civil society, community groups, and donors. To facilitate this, the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock was established upon the request of FAO's Committee on Agriculture in 2010, and FAO is proud to host the Secretariat and contribute as a member. FAO promotes sustainable agriculture within the broader framework of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with particular emphasis on SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, and others as well. But also, FAO considers SDG 17, partnerships for all for global goods, which is central to sustainability and accelerating the progress. The 2030 Agenda requires to establish inclusive, efficient, and responsible food and agriculture. For that, livestock plays a vital role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It is central to the nutrition, livelihood, and resilience of many of the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations. Global discussions since 2018, including Berlin's Global Forum for Food and Agriculture, have focused on 4 overarching themes that the Global Agenda has adopted as a guiding framework in its 2019-2021 Action Plan. Thus, overarching themes are: 1, food and nutrition security. Animal source foods currently make up about 39% of protein and 18% of calorie intake worldwide. However, this is not equitably distributed. Poor people in low and middle income countries are often undernourished. Conversely, people in high income countries, but also increasingly in middle income countries, are much more likely to consume in excess of their dietary needs. 2, livelihoods and economic growth. There are intricate links between poverty, livelihood, and economic growth. In low and middle income countries, livestock is essential to addressing all the 3. The livestock sector currently accounts for more than 1/3 of value addition in agriculture in low and middle income countries. This proportion increases as countries develop economically. More than 1 billion people derive at least part of their income from the livestock sector. 3, animal health and welfare. Animal diseases limit production and reduce livestock's contribution to sustainable development. A recent example of the continuous spread of African swine fever, which is disturbing rural economies and markets across different regions. There are also major human health concerns to zoonotic diseases such as avian influenza, which can be transmitted from animals to human, and to the indiscriminate use of antimicrobials. Therefore, good animal welfare is an important factor both for animal productivity and for animal and human health. It's also an ethical requirement. The first theme is natural resource use and climate. Livestock systems draw heavily on natural resources such as land and water, and distribute substantially to greenhouse gas emissions. This contribution, however, is managed well if they have a potential to contribute to biodiversity of conservation, nutrient cycling, and carbon sequestration, and offer important climate mitigation opportunities with social, economic, and environmental co-benefits. As you know, the theme of our conference is innovation. Innovation in sustainable livestock systems is a very appropriate theme for our purpose today, the 9th multi-stakeholder meeting of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. To improve sustainably, modern science and technologies need to be applied. To innovate, and innovative approaches adopt at all levels. Indeed, innovation is about much more than applying new technologies. Innovation is also about finding new and sustainable use of existing technologies. It's about encouraging new ways of thinking related to areas such as government policies, company strategies, and cooperation models. The Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock provides a platform to enhance technical solutions for sustainable livestock globally, regionally, and nationally. It does this in many ways, such as carrying out analysis to improve resource use efficiency, adopting silvopastoral system or techniques, sometimes agro-silvopastoral, sometimes agropastoral. Promoting multi-criteria grassland models, positioning dairy products as a source of nutrition and employment in Asia, preparing guidelines for environmental impact assessment, providing solid evidence on the positive relationship between dairy and poverty reduction, producing livestock sustainable investment guidelines, implementing productivity, boosting good practice related to animal welfare, and of course, mitigating the impact of antimicrobial resistance. GASL has supported a more holistic view of the livestock sector through the adoption of its integrated approach and the development of multi-stakeholder partnership in countries and regions seeking appropriate policies and legislation in favor of sustainable livestock. For example, in Mesoamerica and South America, focusing on low-carbon livestock production. This is subject also to be scaled up in the objective conditions of Africa. In Mongolia, through the development of National Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, which is now in pipeline, and in Europe, Central Africa, Central Asia, and Brazil goes the same way. Finally, Yet importantly, allow me to mention that FAO has moved towards the proposal to establish the subcommittee on livestock for 2020 COAG session. COAG, as I mentioned, it's the Committee for Agriculture at FAO. We believe this initiative is an opportunity to raise the profile of livestock worldwide and for GASL to make it work more efficient, effective, with strong government involvement. The Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock has a central role to play in driving the innovation that will be crucial to advancing the sustainable food and agriculture agenda in the coming years. Indeed, GASL is a perfect model in being a successful innovation in itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a productive meeting over the coming days, and I look forward to seeing the results of this discussion. I thank you all.
Okay, great. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here at Kansas State University for the 9th Multi-Stakeholder Partnership meeting of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. First time we are in the United States of America, and also the first time in very close collaboration with a university. And with a university, land-grant university, which is fundamental to bring the research results also to the ground. We are very happy to be here. Already now, thousand thanks to the entire team of KSU, led by Nina Lilia and Susan Metzger. And also thank you all sponsors, we will see them later, to have supported this meeting. Without the sponsorship of all these institutions, this meeting would not take place. Before I give you a little overview on the structure of the meeting, a few words on the global agenda. Per has already told us a bit of it. We are a multi-stakeholder partnership, and we enhance the contribution of livestock system to sustainable development, and we now, after a few years, we are recognized a platform for sharing solutions. For us, it is very important to support and magnify the work of our partners with a multi-stakeholder approach. And innovation is crucial for a sustainable development of the livestock sector along the respective value chains. So our main objectives are to facilitate dialogue. That's what we are going to do the next 4 days. We assemble and communicate evidence, science-based evidence, and we advocate for change and practice change. A few words on the structure. Beret Tekola has already mentioned the clusters. We are grouped around clusters, and we are governed by a guiding group, and I have the honor to chair this guiding group. The actual work of the global agenda is actually done in the action networks. They are listed here. You will hear much more about the action networks this week, tomorrow morning, in short presentations, in parallel sessions, and in roundtables. When we look at the membership, as of now we have 111 institutional members, distributed among public sector, private sector, academia research, multilateral intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, and social movements. We have been growing in the last years quite substantially, and we will also have the possibility, I think, Thursday morning in a breakfast session to discuss with interested partners to become members. Now, the structure of this meeting.
The global agenda is working along 4 sustainability domains: livelihoods and economic growth, food and nutrition security, animal health and animal welfare, climate and natural resources. These 4 sustainability domains are closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN Agenda 2030. Now, today, we call it a Science Day. We have discussions on innovation along the 4 Global Agenda sustainability domains. We will get a topic overview. We have respondents. We have examples of innovation in action and some additional perspectives. Tomorrow, we have a policy day. We have panels, role of innovation in sustainable livestock systems, and a role of trade in sustainable livestock systems. And on Wednesday, we have a field day. We have 4 field trips: livestock and environment, animal health and welfare, and antimicrobial resistance are clubbed into one. We also have the possibility to visit the Kansas State Fair, and we have a field visit: livestock agri-food systems from farm to fork. On Thursday, we have the conclusions. We will collect commitments for actions. We will present the 2019-21 Global Agenda Action Plan, and we will get the first insight in the next year's multi-stakeholder partnership meeting in Switzerland. And we also have the guiding group meeting. In addition, today and tomorrow, we will have 40 parallel sessions. We have poster presentations, and we have a lot of open space meeting opportunities for networking, and there will be time for socializing and networking in the coffee breaks and also at lunch and in the dinners. 3 of them are sponsored and are offered. Now again, thank you very much for coming here. We are very proud and happy that we can welcome almost 300 delegates, and I wish you a very fruitful meeting in the next 4 days. Thank you very much and enjoy it.
Great. Now we will begin the first of our 4 plenary sessions, and I'll invite Donald Moore, our session facilitator, to come up. And we appreciate the support from the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, who is a sponsor of this plenary session. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to KSU for organizing this meeting. Nina, Susan, and the team here, I think, have done an outstanding job. My role this morning is really to guide you through the first of our plenary sessions, which is on food and nutrition security. So I will be introducing you to each of our speakers. But before the speakers themselves start, we do have some introductory remarks from the sponsor for this morning's session, which is Dr. Greg Miller from the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. I should properly introduce myself before we start. I am Donald Moore. I'm the Executive Director of an organization called the Global Dairy Platform. I'm based here in the United States, just outside of Chicago, so let me welcome you as well to the United States, given this is my home. And throughout the session this morning, I would like you to think about the questions that you want to ask our presenters. As Susan said before, there is no opportunity for you to stand up with a microphone, but there is plenty of chance for you to text in questions and also to write your questions on a piece of paper, and we have runners who will collect those around the audience. So please spend some time thinking about what you would like to ask our presenters as they share their comments with you this morning. And Dr. Miller, maybe I'll introduce you first to welcome people and share the introduction from the Innovation Center.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you here to this very important meeting on behalf of the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy and America's Dairy Farmers. The Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy brings together processors, dairy farmers, and other members of the value chain to work on projects and programs that develop state-of-the-art best practices for the industry to deliver products that are healthy for people, our planet, and our communities. The dairy industry in the U.S. is committed to continuous improvement, and it's through the Innovation Center that we lead those efforts to improve on a constant basis. You know, I served as a member of a panel of experts for the UN FAO to develop a report on nutrition and food systems. And through that effort, I learned a lot about where are the opportunities within our food system to create opportunities for innovation to deliver more sustainable and more nutritious outcomes from our food systems. But our food system globally is made up of many different types of food systems. And through that process, I learned the important and valuable role that animal livestock needs to play in delivering a sustainable food system that delivers nutrition. It's incredibly important as malnutrition across the globe still remains high. The importance of reducing non-communicable diseases and dealing with climate change. One of the things that I've learned through that process was the important role that livestock can play in reducing our footprint and developing and delivering nutrient-rich foods like dairy. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here together, key thought leaders in our field coming together to share your insights, to share your knowledge, to debate the issues and opportunities. It's through that debating, asking questions, and challenging each other that we will understand where the gaps are, how to fill those gaps, and how to deliver on the opportunities to deliver a sustainable food system. I encourage you throughout this meeting to really engage, to share your thoughts, ask the hard questions. It's only through challenging each other that we will find the solutions that we need to move the animal livestock sector forward in delivering sustainability for our food system and the nutritious outcomes that we need to reduce malnutrition across the globe. So thank you for being here and being a part of this, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate as well. Enjoy the meeting.
Well, thank you. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Miller is often referred to as Dr. Dairy, and you can follow him on Twitter and other social media feeds where he is prolific, I think is probably the best word to use for you, Greg. So thank you for those introductory remarks. Each session today, each of the plenary sessions will follow the same format. We'll have some introductory comments from one of the authors of the 4 papers that were circulated prior to the meeting. So each of the sessions will start with that introductory remarks as sort of an overview for the topic itself. There'll then be a respondent who will share their thoughts and views in terms of the work that has been done and the papers that are produced. And then we'll have several examples of innovations in action. And then in this session, we're going to have an additional perspective provided as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Professor Jeffrey Dahl. He's a professor and Harriet B. Weeks Professorship Endowment Chair for the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida. In this position, he conducts applied and basic research with direct impact on animal production and health. His program focuses on understanding the physiological impact of management interventions, notably photoperiod and heat stress abatement at various stages of the lactation cycle in an attempt to harness the knowledge and to optimize cow health and performance. The fundamental aspects of Dr. Dahl's research has led to application in other agriculturally important species, including sheep, goats, and pigs. Dr. Dahl holds a PhD in animal science from Michigan State University, a master's in dairy science from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and a bachelor degree in animal science with a minor in agricultural economics from the University of Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dahl to the stage.
Thank you, Don. I had forgotten a few of those details in my CV, so I appreciate that. Before I get started, I did want to just thank my co-authors on the paper, and I had to write them down to make sure that I didn't forget anyone. Bola Adesogan, Sarah McCune, Ari Havalar, Saskia Hendricks, and Jesse Veif from here at K-State. So I appreciate your input and help when we were putting that paper together. As I sat and listened to the introductory comments, you will hear that I will probably repeat some things that have already been said in this overview session. But I don't think that repetition is necessarily bad, and I think it helps us to focus on some of the important policy questions we'll be discussing. So quickly, over the next 10 minutes or so, what I just want to do is highlight some of the issues that we see with regard to food and nutritional security, how animal source foods, and I've used the ASF abbreviation there. Hopefully we won't confuse that too many times with African swine fever over the next few days, but how livestock fit into not only food security, but more importantly, nutritional security. How some of the societal impacts and local impacts can influence not just availability of animal source foods, but availability to vulnerable groups. And at the Livestock Lab, we're particularly interested in pregnant, lactating women and children under 2, because those are some of our most vulnerable groups that probably need to have increased access to animal source foods. I'm going to hit on just a couple of the big topics in terms of challenges to livestock food availability, the food versus feed debate and where that stands, and greenhouse gas emissions, and how we can sort of position ourselves to address some of those topics, I think, more effectively. And finally, talk about just broadly some of the other aspects of livestock production around the world that may influence availability to animal source foods. So starting with the definition of food security from the UN Committee on World Food Security, I think it's important to point out that even in that definition of food security, nutrition is an integral part of it. So it's not just caloric availability. There's recognition of the fact that nutrition is a critical component to food security and effective food security. And at the household level in particular, we know that threats to food security can really undermine the efforts to improve nutrition, again, particularly for those vulnerable groups. And so it would follow that if we can make interventions that would improve food security overall, that should improve nutritional security to those vulnerable groups. And of course, one of the most common outcomes of nutritional insecurity is stunting. And this is something that we focus on significantly in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, because it not only has impacts on physical development, but more and more we're realizing that there are significant impacts on cognitive development and overall development of children, and then their ultimate contributions to their societies. So I think that this is something that we need to emphasize more in our discussions, and the importance of animal source foods to nutritional security. And if we look around the world, we've got macro threats, obviously, to access to livestock products and to animal source foods. You're all familiar with all of these, but I think that what we try and do, particularly at the Livestock Lab, is not focus as much on the sort of overabundance in certain areas. While that certainly can be a problem, and it's been already mentioned this morning, our focus is on these areas where there are significant challenges to just full access to livestock products. And at the very local level, there are other influences beyond the macro influences that I talked about in the last slide. Things like gender and the access of women, of children to livestock products. Typically, that's going to be reduced relative to men. And so the groups that may need these products the most are limited in their access to those products, and that can have an influence on nutritional security. So moving into some of the issues, one of the first that we hear commonly is the debate about feed for animals versus food for humans. And I think that we cannot overemphasize the fact that as little as 15% of human consumable products are actually put through animals to produce animal source foods. Most of what animals are consuming are products that have no value in the human food chain. They only have value when they're put through animals and can produce human consumable products. And I think that that's one way to frame the argument, and one way to frame that response is that we're looking at human consumable outputs rather than just feed. In terms of land, there are obviously influences well beyond what that land might be applied for in terms of production of other crops. There's plenty of land around the world that has no value at all to crop production, except for livestock crop production. And so again, when we talk about the idea that production of livestock is limiting access to land that could be used for other purposes, in many areas, that land is only suitable for production of animal source foods. In addition, there are a lot of other outcomes and uses of that land, ecosystem services, wildlife habitat, and even carbon sequestration that may come from application of use of that land to livestock production. So what if we got rid of livestock production completely? This is an extreme boundary that was modeled recently in a paper in PNAS. The idea was in the US that we just eliminate livestock production completely. What effect would that have long term? I think that the outcome in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is fairly limited. They estimated about 2.6 percentage units. But more importantly, when they looked at the impact on nutritional security, it was significant. And it was a significant reduction in nutritional security by completely eliminating livestock production. So again, another way to frame the response to greenhouse gas effects of livestock production. It's not only going to have limits on the livestock industry, but also on nutritional security, and at least in this model in the US, it was a significant one. So one way to move forward, and one way that I'm sure we'll talk about over the next couple of days, is to work to improve the production efficiency of livestock around the world and look at innovations that can help us to drive those improvements in production efficiency. Because when we consider how much animals produce of human consumable food output versus the inputs and the greenhouse gas output, you can see that when we improve production efficiency to the extent that we see in the US versus some other areas, you can have a significant realization of reduction of greenhouse gas output per unit of human consumable food. So we've got sort of competing obligations that we need to address. Feeding a growing population, moving towards 10 billion, but also environmental stewardship. And I think that one of the areas to consider, one of the points to consider, is how we measure the effect of livestock production on the environment. And a more appropriate means of doing that might be to look at emissions per unit of food produced. So emissions intensity rather than just total greenhouse gas output. So when we look at this, it's a fairly straightforward equation, but as we improve the efficiency of livestock production, this measure should improve as well. And so I think that this is one of the things that we can do to meet the growing need for animal and demand for animal source foods globally while decreasing or mitigating some of the environmental impacts. And finally, some of the other factors that need to be considered in any discussion of limiting or increasing animal source food availability to meet the nutritional security needs of global population are the other influences of livestock production, the economic influences of livestock production, particularly in some of the poorer regions of the world. These can't be discounted when we think about livelihoods and access to animal source foods globally. So in terms of summary of the introduction, some of the sort of main factors, livestock production obviously I think is vital for educational, nutritional, and economic sustainability, particularly when we think about improvements in cognitive function with improvements in access to animal source foods. And that is all going to depend and improve nutritional security around the world. Obviously, livestock do contribute to greenhouse gas production, but significant improvements are and should be achievable through increasing the efficiency of livestock productivity globally. We want to look at this in the right way. Emissions intensity, I think, is one way to benchmark this in order to improve not only animal source food yield, but reduce output per unit of human consumable food. And by increasing livestock production, especially in developing and emerging economies, I think that we'll be able to improve food and nutritional security to future populations. And in particular, again, our interest in the livestock lab is improving that to vulnerable populations where it may have lifelong impacts on their quality of life. So with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Dahl, for your opening remarks. We're now going to have our first respondent, Tim Kurt. Tim is with the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. He joined them back in 2016, and Tim is responsible for developing animal research programs to support innovative biological and management approaches to preventing and controlling infectious disease and reducing the reliance upon medically important antibiotics. Tim, welcome to the stage, and we'll invite you to share your response to Professor Dahl's paper.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you to the organizers for offering the opportunity to present today. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in this space and how it relates to really all four of the key themes for the conference today. So I'll provide just a bit of background on the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, or FAR. Very briefly touch on some of the points that Dr. Dahl just mentioned related to livestock and food and nutrition security. And then really what I'd like to talk about are some of these other considerations or obligations, which were also very nicely presented previously. So the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, just to acquaint you all with this organization, it's a relatively new nonprofit that is federally funded and federally established here in the United States. So this was established by Congress and has been funded by Congress as well, with the intent of creating public-private partnerships. So the way that the foundation works is that we've received $385 million in federal funds to date, and this is since 2014 when we were authorized. And we work very closely with other NGOs and with the private sector to match that funding dollar for dollar in innovative research related to agricultural science and technology. So the area that I oversee is essentially all of our animal research programs, and we have quite a broad mandate, but of course this is what's relevant for the discussion today. So as Dr. Dahl mentioned previously, the importance of animal products can't be overstated. Animal source foods account for 25% of the protein and 18% of calories that are consumed globally. They're nutrient dense. These products contain all essential amino acids, and then importantly, besides these macronutrients, they also contain many of the important micronutrients that prevent stunting and other issues. And these include iron, zinc, vitamins A, D, and B12, as well as long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And importantly, in comparison to many of the plant protein sources, there's very low levels of anti-nutrients in animal products. So when we look at them in totality, they're very, very critical for promoting growth, preventing stunting, and supporting healthy brain development. There's other considerations as well, which were also touched upon in the previous talk, which are that livestock convert inedible food resources into high-quality foods. So this is where our grazing ruminant species really can play a role in improving food production and increasing food production. And in addition, they require very minimal processing or added ingredients. And this is something which I think should be stressed as a huge positive in comparison to some of the alternatives that we're seeing out there. And then, of course, they taste great. So no one can complain about that. So I think there's some other considerations or obligations as well that we need to consider when we're looking at animal source foods and how we can meet the growing demand. And really what we're talking about here is trying to improve production and improve access and consumption, particularly in low and middle income countries. And when we look at this global picture, there are projections that we will need to produce as much food in the next 30 years as was produced in the last 10,000 years combined, which is a staggering way of looking at it, and one which I feel can only be, this need can only be addressed by using all of the tools that we have available. And so at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, we are supporting all types of approaches to improving food production, whether plant or animal based, but I see a very important role for animal systems in this next 30 years. Given that, though, I think there are some additional considerations that need to be considered as we move forward, and these all contribute to social license to operate. And these really relate to environment, antibiotic stewardship, and animal health and welfare. And some of these are perhaps more a consideration for intensified systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research is doing to address these issues. So when it comes to environmental issues, we've supported research on grazing management and different types of carbon sequestration models. We're also engaged in some of the recent research on feed additives as a way to reduce methane emissions from enteric fermentation. And so if we just look at that issue a little bit more closely, we see that in the US, approximately 2.7% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to enteric fermentation. And this is fairly significant, being about 30% of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. And a number of different approaches have been tried, none of which have been very successful, although there has been some very interesting recent work on seaweeds, which show that some seaweeds, particularly the Asparagopsis type of seaweeds, can actually reduce methane emissions quite significantly. There's a significant amount of work that's still needed, though, in order for us to actually implement this innovation. both the production of these seaweeds, but also the safety, the impact on animal health and feed conversion efficiency, and many other considerations. So these are things that we're engaged with. In addition, we have established an international consortium for antimicrobial stewardship in agriculture, and this is a program which brings together private sector partners to support research on antimicrobial stewardship. This is a program which FAR has committed $7.5 million to, and the way it works is that the organizations that are part of the program have formed working groups to develop projects around these 5 priority areas, which are considered major drivers of antibiotic use in the industry. They must collaborate in order to support projects, and then they can receive the matching funds as a way to leverage their investment in these research projects. And here are a number of the organizations that are involved with this program. I'm very proud to say we've got representatives from both Noble and High Plains, as well as the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and perhaps others in the room. I apologize if I've missed anyone here. And we're very excited. This program was just launched earlier this year, so some of the research projects are still in development, but we've actually already initiated one project looking at late onset bovine respiratory disease. So the intent of this program is really to develop research that has practical outcomes for industry. In the welfare space, we have a number of programs. We have a prize program for new technologies that can differentiate the sex of eggs. The reason being that primarily in the layer industry, where birds have been bred for efficient egg production, we see that males are actually culled the day they hatch. So we are actually losing about 6 billion male birds after 21 days of incubation. So there's a fairly significant carbon footprint associated with this, as well as it being a food waste and animal welfare concern. So we're looking for solutions that can actually solve this problem and do it at commercial scale. And then we're also working closely with McDonald's on technologies for monitoring broiler welfare on farm. And so these would be automated remote technologies that can provide reporting and outcomes on farm in commercial poultry operations. So in conclusion, I think it's clear that livestock production improves food and nutritional security, especially for pregnant and lactating women and infants and young children. There are still some considerations and issues that remain, one of those being greenhouse gas emissions and environmental issues such as nutrient recycling, and as well as antibiotic stewardship and then health and welfare of the animals themselves. We feel very strongly that cross-sector collaboration is key to improvement in this space, and that's exactly what FAR was created to do and what we're excited to continue doing. And with that, I thank you again for the opportunity and look forward to the interactions with all of you over the next 2 days.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. Our next speaker is going to be the first of our examples of innovation in action, and that's our presenter will be Chesa Luter, who's worked for more than 25 years on policies and programs to improve maternal and child nutrition in low and middle income countries, and working with the World Health Organization. Chesa recently retired from a 19-year career as a senior advisor in food and nutrition at the Pan America Health Organization, PANO, the regional office for the World Health Organization in the Americas. At PAHO, she led the development and evaluation of a multi-regional nutritional strategy and action plans, and in particular was involved in presenting a plan for the prevention of obesity in children and adolescents, which was approved by all countries of the General Assembly of the United Nations back in 2014. Prior to joining PAHO, she worked for the Food and Nutrition Board in the US, the National Academy of Sciences, and NGO organizations dedicated to promoting breastfeeding. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you so much to K-State for the invitation. My mom was born and raised in a sod house about 400 miles west of here, and as a student at K-State, she met my dad stationed at Fort Riley, so thanks K-State. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. So really delighted to have the second opportunity in my life to visit K-State. So what I'd like to do is briefly cover 3 topics today, to look at infant and young child feeding requirements, and the recommendations for feeding and evidence-based for animal source foods interventions. Really focusing my talk on egg research, which has been my focus over the past 5 years of my work, and then some of the challenges and opportunities for scaling up production in low and middle income countries, really to improve access to eggs. So in terms of global recommendations for infant and young child feeding, the World Health Assembly in 2003 endorsed the global strategy for infant and young child feeding, and in this says as a public health recommendations, infants should be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months of life. That means no water, no tea, no juice, no other sources of liquids or foods. Extremely important for the well-being of that child or that infant. And then at 6 months, infants should receive nutritionally adequate and safe complementary foods while breastfeeding continues for 2 years or beyond. We've heard 3 times this morning already the contribution of animal source foods to overall protein intake in the world, and I wish I had calculated the protein from breast milk to have also shared that with you today, because it is so crucial to the young infant diet. In 2003, we published what are now the guiding principles for complementary feeding of the breastfed child. Hopefully WHO will be updating these shortly, but there's still the global recommendation. And Guiding Principle 8, which addresses the nutrient content of complementary foods, reads, "It is advisable to include meat, poultry, fish, or eggs in complementary food diets as often as possible." Really recognizing then, as we continue to do today, that these foods are critical to support healthy growth and development of young children. So if we look at this slide, which really shows what we need to get from complementary foods for an infant 9 to 11 months of age that's also being breastfed. So what we do is in this slide, we're taking out the contribution of breastfeeding. Let's see if I can find the pointer here. We're taking out the contribution that breast milk is providing to this infant and looking at, okay, what else do they need to meet their dietary requirements for healthy growth and development. If I start at the bottom, you can basically see if the mother is well nourished in vitamin C, water-soluble nutrient, baby doesn't need any more vitamin C. Needs very little vitamin A, actually doesn't need a lot of protein, getting back to my protein content of human milk. But as we go up the list, we can see that almost 100% of the iron and zinc needs to be provided in complementary foods. Breast milk is not a good source of these nutrients. Likewise for niacin, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. Calcium, obviously, is, let's see, about over 50%, let's say about 65% of calcium would need to be provided through complementary foods. And what do we see in terms of what complementary feeding diets look like? I'm focusing on Latin America here. It's where most of my work, certainly my career at WHO, was focused on the Latin American region. So in Peru, babies get this very, very thin soup with a little bit of noodles in it. The mothers think this is sort of the essence of what they need, not enough to sustain healthy growth. In Colombia, we see there's rice, there's some cookies, a couple beans there. Again, not enough to sustain healthy growth. What we'd like to see more is a diet such as this, so some sort of a thick gruel, energy dense, with meat, egg, or fish, added. I mean, that's what we would like to see babies getting. We don't see milk here, again, but these babies are being breastfed or should be breastfed. So what's our evidence base for animal source food interventions? There are a lot of individual studies showing the importance of animal source foods for healthy growth. Unfortunately, when you take these collectively and use some of the really rigid criteria for assessment, we find out there's limited quality of evidence, there's uncertain effects of animal source foods versus cereals, or no intervention, and that we really need adequately powered trials with consistent definitions. We still really need more of an evidence base for this. But I'd like to focus now a little bit on eggs. Incredibly nutrient rich. If you can see, one egg would provide more than 25% of the baby's needs for energy, more than 50% of a baby's needs for protein, choline particularly important for brain development. Egg is the best source per calorie of choline of any food, extremely important for cognitive development. And in an intervention trial that colleagues and I did from University of California, Davis and Washington University in the rural highlands of Ecuador, a highly stunted indigenous population, we showed actually that a 6-month egg intervention, 1 egg per day for young, starting at around 6 months, that babies, we saw a reduction in 47% in the prevalence of stunting and a higher prevalence in the reduction of low weight for age. So very dramatic findings adding animal source food to the diets of these children. Unfortunately, our recent trial to replicate this study in Malawi did not have this dramatic effect. We were disappointed. What happened in Malawi is maize is a staple as opposed to a potato. There was a very high intake of fish, animal source food. So I think, to really see these effects, we do need to go to populations where there isn't another animal source food to really isolate that effect of adding that animal source food. Consumption is very low. It increases. It's lowest in Africa, increasing, this 6 to 8 months, 9 to 11 months, 12 to 18 months, 9 to 24 months. Increases throughout every age range, just about, but it's lowest in Africa, highest in Latin America. And kind of why is that? People would argue often that, there are cultural considerations. Mothers don't want to give eggs. They're considered taboo in many countries. But when we really look at this very carefully and do qualitative research around it, we really find price is a huge barrier and seems to be the biggest barrier in providing eggs to young children. And what this graph shows is a ratio of caloric egg prices to caloric starchy staple prices in these individual countries. And you can see that in North America and really Mexico, an egg is only about 2 times the price of a caloric staple. Whereas if you get into some of these African countries, it's really 8 to 25 times. I mean, just prohibitively expensive. The first need you have is to meet your energy needs, and that's what you're going to spend your money on. So what do we see going on? Very high relative prices. Eggs are highly perishable. They don't travel well. Very low productivity of village poultry production. Families have eggs. Our study in Ecuador, over 50% of these families had eggs. In Malawi, 40% of these families had eggs. They've got the chickens. The chickens really aren't producing very much. And what little they produce is they're sold, or it's really, an egg is a chicken, so why would you sell or feed your child the egg? Really feed your child the egg. There are very large economies of scale in poultry production. And commercial poultry, particularly in Africa, faces very, very high feed costs. There's a lot of work on this and the importance of actually bringing down these feed costs to facilitate commercial production in Africa. So we really, for commercial production, reduced the cost of the input, and again, particularly the feeds. But one of the reasons my colleagues and I were so interested in doing our egg research is the role of local production is a way for women's empowerment, for rural development. And so to look at this more carefully, really address the high mortality, improve egg yield. Shouldn't surprise anyone here. We need better distribution of Newcastle vaccine, heat-resistant breeds, and sustainable models. it can't just be driven by donor input, because these donors leave and these programs tend to die pretty quickly. So this example of farm input promotion, FIPS, based in Kenya, really is a sustainable model looking at village poultry advisors or farm input advisors. So they buy in bulk the Newcastle, they can sell it to small individual farmers who are willing to invest, but they can't buy the whole batch of Newcastle. You know, they can only buy a few for those chickens they have, to look into supporting small hatcheries to protect the chickens, better breeds of chickens, et cetera. It's been a very successful model. Just to close, before my closing takeaway messages, this again gives us a relative caloric price of different animal source foods in 176 countries, grouped by income levels. So we have orange as high income, upper middle, lower middle, and then low income countries. And you can see the huge dose response in the cost of these foods relative to the staple. And just the importance of, the absolute importance. Eggs are actually more expensive in low-income countries than the other animal source foods. It's kind of hard to imagine, but this is what the data show. So the importance of looking at innovative, sustainable ways to bring down the cost of these foods, as well as obviously improve income so that households can access these foods in low and middle income countries. So my key takeaways: they are absolutely essential, animal source foods, for improving infant and young child nutrition in low and middle income countries. We do need to have a better evidence base, no question. You know, with the concerns right now about the environment and the role of animal source foods and contributing to environmental degradation, we've got to have that evidence base for infants and young children. Compared to high-income countries, the poorer the country, the higher the cost, and these are where these foods are most needed. We really need to get down, and there's evidence that we really need large-scale production in low and middle-income countries to reduce the cost of eggs. At the same time, we really can't forget the role of local production, both in terms of producing the eggs and the chickens, but also empowerment of women and rural development. And so with that, I thank you very much and look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much to our last presenter. And as I look around the audience, I see many of you typing away furiously on your phones. I hope that those are questions that you are forming for the presenters, not that you are recording your diary for the day or texting your mother or other significant members of your family. So please do consider the questions you would like to ask our presenters as they are presenting to you. Our next speaker is John Neiman. He is the president of Protein Ingredients and International with GASL. He's been with GASL since 2001, and for 8 years prior to that, he was with Elanco Animal Health. So he has an extensive background and experience in the animal ag industry. John has extensive experience with also the international and strategic customers, marketing, supply chain, business improvement, and operations across multiple different protein fields. And John, I believe you're a graduate from Kansas State University. So let me welcome you to the stage, but I guess this is your home rather than mine. So.
Put it in presentation mode here. All right, so first of all, it is always great to be back at my alma mater. I will say, just for those that are writing down big questions, you'll notice that I am not a PhD like the other three speakers, so when you ask a question, keep it simple, okay? Again, I want to just say welcome. We're excited that Kansas Agriculture and Kansas State University can host such a great event, and it's an honor that I was able to drive a couple hours this morning to be here for a global conversation. And I spend a lot of my time on the road, traveling the world, talking to people about protein. And so this fits right in, and these conversations are crucially important. So a little bit about Cargill. And for some of you, you may know us, but we are the largest privately held company in the world. We have a big footprint. And so with that comes a big responsibility, but 155,000 employees in nearly 70 countries. And so when we talk about feeding the world, while we started with a small grain elevator 150 some years ago in Conover, Iowa, the imprint that we have and the responsibility we have is something that we take very seriously. It's part of our core values to know that when we talk about nourishing the world in a safe, responsible, and affordable way, and do that with the impetus that we have to have a sustainable model. That this isn't just about who is hungry now, but it's also about feeding the future. And when we see that protein consumption and demand is going to grow by nearly 70%, and some of the slides you've seen before is that we have a lot to do in the next 30 years. And the way that we do that and how we do that and how we connect with our growers and consumers is a very complex conversation, but it's a great opportunity. And for those of you that are here today, it allows us the chance to have a dialogue about what do we do next and how do we take care of this great planet. So my responsibility today is to give you some examples of some work that we're doing. Now, it's not an exhaustive list. I've got 4 examples I'm going to give you in terms of how we're partnering, because we believe that the importance of the vitality and success of a farmer is critically important no matter where they are based around the world. We also believe that it's critically important that we address the needs and demands and concerns that consumers might have. And to do that, one of the things that was mentioned already is partnership and doing things collaboratively. And so this is an example where we worked on what's called the Central Nebraska Irrigation Project. And in this case, it was a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, Nestle Purina, so the feed side of the business. Part of my responsibilities would be the animal byproducts that would go into the feed system. We also work in the food ingredient system. And so we partner with a company like Nestle, both in their animal side of the business as well as their human side on a global basis. And by doing this, we put together these sensors, and this technology is new in one sense, but people have been working on this for years to monitor when a crop needs irrigated. And instead of just putting it on a timer and going out and manually adjusting it, this is all on an app, and the sensors tell the farmer when it's time to water. So we're testing the soil moisture. And there are times that just out of habit and out of programming, we may overwater. And so through this sensor system and through the efficiency and time savings, we've estimated that in this project we've saved 2.4 billion gallons of water over 3 years. Now, what does that mean for the state of Nebraska? Well, we have a beef processing plant, and one of the things that was talked about is there's a large connection between the amount of water it takes to produce a crop that feeds an animal that we process. And what we're saving is about the same amount of water that it takes to process on the beef processing end. So we're actually in a closed loop system of partnership. We're creating efficiency in saving water and then using that water to process the meat. So what we find is that there's collectively a much better footprint improvement in Nebraska on this project. This is another one that's in our turkey business, and this is really from a consumer interest standpoint. We implemented blockchain technology where we have identified, we know where our birds are grown and who they're grown by, and they come to us in those groups from the farmers. We have 700 independent farmers that raise birds for us, and we're able to track their birds from their farm all the way through the processing. And then we are able to put that on a QR code that goes onto the bird, and that's a frozen turkey that goes into retail. And then the consumer can use their phone and scan that code, and it will let them know the name, the location, and they literally virtually get to meet the farmer. And so the farmers have done interviews, they've done questions, they talk about their operation, and it gives this connection from a consumer standpoint and answers where does my food come from and who's producing that product. And then last year we had 200,000 honeysuckle white turkeys during Thanksgiving go out with this QR code on. And we're continuing to develop this idea, developing learnings. It's a great engagement for farmers. And there are many of them out there who are great advocates and want to tell their story. So the latest project that we're working on, it ties well to some of the conversations that were had and many of the things in the agenda over the next couple of days, and that is a program we just launched called Beef Up Sustainability. And really this works in 4 specific segments of grazing management, feed production, innovation, and then also making sure that the food with a purpose, we really want to look at how do we connect and how do we reduce food waste on the other end. So it's a really end-to-end management. And I think when you start to look at the global context of sustainability, and I will tell you that we farm ground outside of Wichita, Kansas, south of here about 2.5 hours. I grew up on a farm in northeast Kansas, and I will just tell you from a personal standpoint, these are the things that farmers and ranchers wake up and think about every day, because it is good business for them to take good care of their animals. It's good business for them to take good care of their land. And I think as we think about the efficiency of the system, it's important. And so some numbers to think about is that 8% of the cattle in the globe are in the United States, but they produce 18% of the beef. And so that tells you there's already a 35% more efficiency than average. And part of that is by the way that people are feeding, using resources, and optimizing the outputs. And we know that if we are 2% of the greenhouse gas, while we want to make sure we make an improvement on that, we also want to look at the success of the farmers and ranchers and what they have evolved and done in terms of a pound-for-pound basis of what they do. That nutrient-dense efficiency is critically important. And I liked the way it was talked about earlier by Dr. Dahl, in the sense that we really need to measure at the most efficient level, because that's the way we change the game and help people in other countries become more efficient at what they do. And as we think about wealth increasing from a global standpoint, then people move from their carbohydrates, they move to protein. And so the better we get and the more efficient we are at that model, the better chance we have of having a sustainable food system and meeting the demands of a growing population. And as a part of that, I would also say that we have a big egg business, and so we like the conversation about a nutrient-dense and efficient product, and certainly have to figure out how we can convert the efficiency from how we do it here in the United States to the way that from a cost standpoint, accessibility. But as you look at these practices, what this is really about is partnership. And what it's about is a conversation to take action. And while we set goals, and some of those goals, it's hard to achieve every one of them, but we are constantly looking for ways to be better. And the only way to make those choices and changes is by doing it through a partnership. We as Cargill can't do it alone. Any of these agencies or other connections cannot do it alone either. So the last example I want to give, and I'm personally passionate about this organization, and globally you may not be familiar with the National FFA, or as some people talk about, the Future Farmers of America. But it's a youth leadership organization that is in junior highs and high schools. And there's almost 1 million students that are in ag education. 700,000 of them participate on the leadership side. We've actually engaged a conversation with some of our global customers about this organization, because we think that there's a really important conversation to have. And it's great to have NGOs and academia and industry and producers in a room. But one of the elements that we think is important is the voice of the student. Why? Because they're your future customer. They're the future leaders. They're the ones who are ultimately going to be making choices. And for us, that's who we're handing this world and planet off to. So we kicked off a challenge. It's called the Sustainability Challenge, that we are working with FFA and other partners on to engage in a conversation, students, academia, NGOs, collectively together to say, hey, what is this about? What does it mean, and how do we solve? And what I love about this organization is what it does for young people. And I know personally, because if it wasn't for FFA, I know I wouldn't be standing here today, because it gave me a chance to look into the eyes of all the opportunities in agriculture, and I thank them for that. And so our partnership with them is really about that. And what I hope happens, because I know we have a lot of the Kansas State students coming in and out of this session in the next couple of days, is that we see those students, their voice, their questions, and also their ideas as part of the empowerment to the answers when we go forward. Looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that presentation. Now, for those of you who aren't tapping away on your cell phones and you're furiously writing your questions, if you just hold them up, there are runners in the room who will come and collect them from you. And if they haven't done that, just wave them around a little bit, and we'll make sure they get picked up and circulated. Our final presenter for this session is Simplice Nula. Dr. Nula is the head of agriculture and food security at the African Union. He's responsible for the formulation and implementation of African Union policies, strategies, and programs to promote sustainable agricultural growth and transformation on the African continent. He oversees and coordinates the implementation of several continental programs and initiatives on sustainable agricultural systems, food security, and food safety. And prior to that, he was also the Chief Animal Production Officer, where he played a key role in formulating various continental and regional policies and producing strategic documents on livestock and pastoral systems and fisheries in Africa. Dr. Nula, let me welcome you to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you very much, moderator, for the introduction. I would like to thank the organizer. It's a while that I've not been with you, the Global Agenda, and I'm happy to be back. And it's an honor to have the African Union at this session, because when we speak food security, and you will see later on, the heart of food and security is on the continent in Africa. Now, I will share with you some new approaches in addressing food and security issues in Africa, and we will see how this speaks to livestock towards the end of my presentation. Now, I don't know who put, but I want to have everything at once, I think. Now, I was saying it's an honor to have the African Union at this first session, because food and security in the world, the heart is in Africa. And if we look at the latest statistics by FAO, over 257 million people are suffering food insecurity on the continent. And despite that, we import as a continent almost 35 billion USD worth of food to feed the population. And this will increase to about 110 billion by 2025. And this simply means, as a continent that suffers poverty, we export a lot of money, we export jobs just to feed our population. And despite this, we are unable to satisfy the population, because we still have more than 250 million people to feed. Now, why is it that the continent is suffering? Because the agricultural sector is basically undeveloped on the continent. We have very low productivity. The sector lacks transformation, and we depend mostly on red-fed agriculture. We have issues related to barriers to trade, and someone speaks some minutes before me that if you want to address issues of food security, you may also think of addressing issues related to market access. And more importantly, our policy and institutional environment is not adequate to develop, to facilitate the development of the sector. Now, at the African Union, how are we thinking to address the issues of food security? This is done within what we call the Agenda 2063, which is the blueprint of the Africa that we want. And I pick here two aspirations that speaks to food security. The aspiration one of our Agenda 2063 is that of a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And the aspiration 6 that speaks to an Africa where the development is driven by people and unleashing the potential of its women and youth. So why was the rationale behind these aspirations and the goals? Because for the last 50 years after independence, we basically look food security in the lens of increasing agricultural production and productivity. And just addressing the issues of production and productivity has not helped the continent, simply because we failed to look at food security in a more holistic manner. So that the way we are thinking now, and this is our innovative approach, is to look at all the issues that surround food security. And here we are looking at issues related to policies. And it was mentioned by Dr. Behe that innovation is also about thinking differently. How do we have policies that are coherent enough on the continent to address issues related to food security? We need to look at issues related to market, to gender, to food safety, and here issues related to antimicrobial resistance was raised. You can't say unsafe food is food. Unsafe food is basically no food. So all these issues are issues that we try in an innovative manner to tackle in order to address issues of food security on the continent. And to this, we have developed a set of frameworks to assist our member states to tackle issues of food security. And the most recent is the African Continental Free Trade Area. This gives us hope that with the openings of the markets on the continent, countries will now tap into their potential. There's no need for all countries to produce the same thing. You need to focus on crops or commodities where you have a comparative advantage and you can trade easily. So this for us is a significant landmark, and we think this will drive agricultural transformation on the continent. Our leaders' cognitions of the fact that we need to transform agriculture took some commitment. And this commitment ranges from the policies to the resilience aspect. And one most important commitment is the mutual accountability. We are known as a continent or as an organization where decisions are taken and nobody follows implementation. But this time we followed the implementations of our decisions, mainly related to agricultural transformation, through the Commitment 7, in which every 2 years we measure the progress that member states made towards achieving the goals of ending hunger on the continent, mainly by 2025, because this is one of our main goals. Now, how does this translate into livestock? We developed what we call the Livestock Development Strategy for Africa, and this strategy tried to address the issues of growth in terms of production and productivity, taking advantage of trade, addressing the issues of hunger, and you have said long here, addressing the issues of environmental sustainability and efficient use and the biodiversity loss. These are issues that this addresses, and finally it addresses the issues of emerging and re-emerging zoonotic diseases. What do we take as message? And I want to take some time on this. I know I still have 2 minutes. Now, we know there have been progress made on the continent in terms of addressing issues of food insecurity, but the situation remained worsened. And this is simply because these issues have never been addressed in a more holistic manner. It has been addressed in a more fragmented manner. And if we look in the room, when we are talking of livestock development here, I don't know how many people are here from the crop side, because you can't speak livestock development if you don't speak crop development. And we need to approach this in a more holistic manner. And the role of government is essentially this, in developing the policies that will facilitate the transformation of the sector. And more importantly, we need at country level to have platforms such as these ones, but more inclusive platforms where we have all the stakeholders along the food security value chain when we are discussing food security in our country. This is not the case as we speak. And finally, food security is central to the economic transformation of the continent. You can't achieve economic transformation in Africa if you don't address issues of food security. I want to thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters, and please, again, lead with me in welcoming and thanking our presenters for their talks this morning. I do have a number of questions that have been asked from the audience. There's still time if you want to submit additional questions. But the first one, I guess, probably directed to Tim, I think probably you in the first instance, is to do with the disease impact on animal production in different parts of the world. And it has been mentioned by a number of our presenters, and indeed there was a question raised from the audience about, how do we best respond to these issues of disease in different parts of the world, and should we consider moving animal-sourced food production around so that it allows us to eliminate disease in certain areas, or I'll leave that to you.
That's it. Can you hear me okay? So if I understand the question, it relates to whether we should focus animal production in certain regions as a mechanism to mitigate disease. I think that's an interesting concept. I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment on that. It sounds like it would have a lot to do with trade and policies related to production of various commodities and feed, and where those animals can best be produced. That's the way I look at it, at least. So certain breeds have evolved in certain regions and are adapted to those regions. So that certainly has implications as to their efficiency and their resilience in the face of disease. So I think a lot of that happens sort of naturally, and is shaped by the economic viability of being able to actually, or the sustainability of being able to produce animals in that region. But if I didn't answer that question, I'm happy to allow any of the other panelists here to take a stab at it.
I think that was the hardest question on my list, so thank you for that stab, Tim. Now, remembering that there are 4 plenary sessions today, and for each of the plenaries there was a white paper produced. You've probably had the opportunity to review it on the website, and after the meeting ends we will be collecting all the feedback on those different papers so that we can produce them and publish them as outcomes and proceedings from this meeting. So do take the time to provide feedback either through the website or directly to the authors of those papers. I guess a question that I would direct to all of the members of our panel today is that we hear a lot about debate in the world at the moment about the role of animal livestock versus plant-based foods. And how do you consider we should bring some balance into that debate? And I'll start, Jeffrey, with you. How do we bring balance to the debate that's raging at the moment about the role of animal-sourced foods versus plant-based alternatives?
So you start with an animal scientist with a question about balance of animal-sourced foods versus plant-based foods. I'm not sure that's...
That wasn't balanced, was it?
No. Well, I think that bringing up some of these sort of, for want of a better term, headline sorts of points that we need to make in terms of the ability of animal source foods to improve not only physical but cognitive development, particularly in some of the areas where there's limitations on access to those foods, is important. But I think even here in the US, we see issues related to a lack of nutrients from animal source foods affecting development in children. One of the ones that, again, from a personal standpoint, that just because I tend to track the dairy-related information, and we're seeing that pediatricians are reporting an increase in evidence of rickets. And so that's related to dietary choices that parents are making without full understanding of the nutritional components of what they're feeding their children. So I think it's a bigger sort of problem that we need to do from an educational standpoint, but some of these, what I'll again term sort of headlines that we can use to drive our points home are important.
Thank you. Chesa?
Thank you. Well, I would certainly argue very strongly, certainly the importance, and I think this is brought up in almost all the presentations, the importance of animal source foods during pregnancy and lactation for the under 2, really the under 5. I think there's just no doubt, as my presentation showed, we need more evidence, no question, for the effect on birth outcomes, growth and development, cognitive development, but there's really no question if you look at the nutrient gaps during these critical points of time that these foods are essential. You know, I think if we look beyond 5 years of age, I think it becomes a lot more nuanced, I guess, I would say. As a nutritionist, I really hate the word balanced. It just, what does that mean? It means something different to everybody else. What is a balance? I mean, that word just kind of boggles my mind, even though we, as a nutrition community, uses it all the time. But I think, you know, then there needs to be more nuanced about the importance of that role, but recognizing that, you know, really from a nutritional perspective, you know, all the other types of foods that are part of a complete diet. We talk now more and more in the nutrition community about unprocessed and minimally processed foods is basic to the diet, and go lighter on the processed and what we call ultra-processed foods right now. Animal source food, you know, most of the presentations, a meat, a milk would be considered unprocessed. You know, minimally processed would be a yogurt, as long as it doesn't have too much sugar. Things like that. So I guess I would kind of frame it maybe in those perspective, but, you know, as a nutritionist who focuses on maternal and child nutrition, you know, I will defend to my dying breath the importance of these foods during these critical periods of life.
Thank you. Tim?
I think that was well said. I don't have anything to add.
So I think the question we always get, because as a large food company, we're in all of it. And so we don't see it as an either-or conversation on plant-based versus animal-based. We believe that from a global standpoint, it all matters. I think if you travel the world and you see places where just the basics of supply chain don't make sense because the grain isn't there to feed the animal or vice versa, we have to figure out the most efficient way to eliminate scarcity And in some cases, we can do that with plant-based, maybe more efficient than animal-based. In other countries, it's the total opposite, as it was mentioned. And so if we force upon the world that you have to have eggs as your primary protein and it's not affordable, then you create a financial issue. Whereas it could be the other way around in a country like Mexico, where their per capita consumption of eggs is the highest in the world. And most of those are grown in the backyard today. And so I think when you take that and then you take the plant-based, which we're invested in, and we're invested in other alternatives, and we get criticized a bit for being invested in those because most know us as more of an animal-based company. We think it's important to be at the table. We think it's an important place to learn and understand where consumers are going, and we do believe that it's not an either-or conversation, because the balance, or whatever word you want to use, in a diet is super important, and having a clean label food. So one of the challenges with a lot of the alternative foods out there now is they're a complex label. And there's a lot of ingredients, and my wife's a personal trainer and nutritionist, and she'd tell you that if you can't pronounce what's in it, you might want to shy away or minimize the consumption of it. And so I think the importance is that we understand how to find the sweet spot in all the alternatives and figure out the answers, because we have a lot of people to feed, and we've got to do it in different ways to be responsible from a global standpoint.
Thank you. And Simplest?
Thank you. I think the debate here is a bit imbalanced. You know, we in Africa, the debate is okay. We take note of the debate, but it's not even an issue. We are on the continent where the average consumption of meat is about 15 to 20 kgs per year. Now you want to bring a debate that is happening elsewhere, where you are talking of 100 kgs of meat per year. So I think the debate is in balance here, and we always tell people, and the lady, she put it quite well, if you look at the first 1,000 days, you can't afford to use at least milk to reduce standing. You can afford in Africa. And I think the debate today in Africa is how do we at least reach 30 kgs on average, not how do we reduce. I think when we are discussing crop source food and animal source food, we need to see the context in which this debate happened.
Thank you. Thank you. Changing gears slightly, there was a couple of questions around transparency in the supply chain, and I think, John, these are predominantly for you to start off with. And there's some interest about the turkeys that the honeysuckle white, I think it was, honeysuckle white turkey, and the way that you had created this linkage back to farmers where people could scan the QR code and effectively meet the farmer. And so it's a very obvious example of this transparency through our supply chain. There were some questions around wanting to know how many people who bought the turkey of your 200,000 actually followed that linkage. You know, is this something that is in high demand, or is this something that is more quirky and of interest, but maybe ultimately doesn't really?
I think that consumers ask for a lot of things, but aren't necessarily as passionate about either following through on what they asked for, or maybe even paying for it, because it's not free to trace an animal back to the farm. And so I think the importance is that we're still learning. From a consumer standpoint, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think about 20 to 30% of them in certain markets paid attention, but in other markets it was much lower. So I think part of this is, having a traceable turkey may not make sense for every market. So you have to figure out, where are people interested in knowing where their food came from. I know where my food came from, so I'm probably not going to log in. But there are a lot of people that may not know, and as people get further away from agriculture, less than 2%, almost 1% in the U.S. is involved directly in ag production. People have a curiosity. But I think the challenge is then, and there's a program launched here in Kansas called Cattle Trace, and it's the same type of deal. While it's good information, we have to figure out if it's something people are willing to pay for. Because at the end of the day, it's not easy and it's not free, And if people want that information, we're willing to provide it, but it's going to make the food cost more. And I think that sometimes in the U.S., where we have plenty of food and seldom go to bed hungry, we ask for a lot. And in other places, where just having that nutrient and that substance is the most important thing. They're probably not worried about where it came from, so long as it's safe. And I think that's the most important thing that we can do.
Thank you. While our session was on nutritional security, there were a number of questions related to, I think a number of the presentations talked about greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a question, maybe Jeffrey, if I ask you this one, and it was really a question around why we'd focused on methane and had ignored other greenhouse gas emissions such as CO2 and the use of fossil fuels more generally. No.
I'm not sure that one is.
This one's on.
So I'm not sure that, again, you've got the expert you want on this one particularly, but I think that most of the emphasis on methane has been on the fact that it is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. I think what is often not emphasized enough is that it turns over much more rapidly than CO2, so its contribution may not be as severe as people think. In terms of limiting methane output, I think that that's just one of the many things that come along with improved efficiency of animal production. When we think about the overall efficiency improvements that we see in water utilization, any of those, they're all going to sort of follow the same path. So it's a good marker, I think, but for a lot of the other environmental aspects, they're going to sort of follow along the same line. We improve our efficiency related to greenhouse gas output, we're probably improving our efficiency utilization of all aspects of that animal production.
Thank you. Last question I have before I invite the panelists to give some closing remarks. Last question is for you, Chesa, and it was to do with the efforts to improve chicken egg production. And there was really a question about whether there was any work going on with the production selection techniques for breeding of chickens in some of those developing regions, and whether you've been working in that area.
Is this on? There's a tremendous amount of work going on. I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to answer that question. I'm a nutritionist. We did a supplement recently in maternal and child nutrition. It's open source, 2018, where we have articles specifically addressing some of the veterinary aspects of chicken breeds, as well as kind of One Health, how we can be sure we're also addressing some of the environmental concerns associated with chicken production. So all as I can say without going to a lot of specific details, which I don't know because I'm a nutritionist and have only gotten into sort of the production side because of my recent work on egg nutrition and child nutrition. There's a lot of work going on. I think my understanding is when you get these improved breeds, they're much, you can increase, the egg production. I think I read somewhere from 50 eggs a year to 300 or something. I mean, phenomenal improvements. Not quite sure of the numbers. I'd have to look those up. But huge improvements. But at the same time, then you have to, you need the chicken coops and you need the improved feeds and you've got to have the GASL vaccine. There's inputs involved. And so you have to be sure then farmers have access or households have access to those inputs. But I would refer you to the supplement, Maternal and Child Nutrition 2018. And then there's other articles, a lot referenced in that supplement about different, also other work going on in improving animal breeds, and particularly in Africa in very dry climates, but other parts of the world as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to share some closing remarks, and Simplest, if you don't mind, I'll start with you and work my way back to Jeffrey, who is the lead author on our paper.
Okay, thank you very much. In closing, I think addressing issues of food security, and mainly related to livestock, require that we think differently, that we change the narrative. I think we have been such as speaking to the converted. And it is time that we bring around the table other protagonists. And today, it is clear that when we are talking especially of monogastric production in Africa, that is where the growth is seen, we need to talk to the crop producers. Because you can't plan, and mainly at policy level, you can't plan to increase your poultry production if on the other side you don't plan to increase maize or sorghum production. So these policies should be coherent, and we need to bring those people around the table when we are discussing the contribution of livestock to food security.
Thank you. John?
I think what's great about this conversation is that we each come with a different perspective and different experiences and different needs in the food value chain. And I think it was talked about as the scarcity value chain. And there are places of plenty and there's places of scarcity. There's places of efficiency and inefficiency. There's places with great supply chains and ones that create a lot of waste because they're a poor supply chain. And the idea really in all of this is that we share and collaborate and challenge each other to get better. And even if we're producing, the world's most efficient protein in a given area because of our crop production and water resources, then we need to share those practices, because us exporting grain into a country so that they can produce livestock and it's not as efficient is a challenge. And we have to find ways to create a global system that's efficient, and yet at the same time we take care of producing a safe and affordable product as well. And that's our grand challenge. I think that's our responsibility across this table and the people in the room, and so look forward to the dialogue around it.
Thank you. And Tim?
Yeah, so I would just agree. I think several of the panelists have talked about the interrelatedness of the supply chain, the feed sources, the animal breeds, the geographic locations in which they're raised, the diseases and the biosecurity practices which are needed in those locations. And so I think looking at it from a very holistic and cross-disciplinary manner is both completely necessary, but then leads completely into the idea of collaboration being absolutely necessary to address any of the issues which are being faced. And it's not to say that there can't be competition. There will always be competition, but some of these issues I think are bigger than any one person or any one organization. And so that's where I think there's really a huge opportunity.
Thank you. Jesse?
Thank you very much. I would just really like to emphasize what I talked about in my first slide, the very important role of breastfeeding. So absolutely we need to talk about all animal source foods, but let's just not forget in low, middle, and high income countries, the important role of this first food in terms of all that it provides, not just nutritionally high quality protein, but also all the immune defenses that are so critical to certainly prevention of mortality and morbidity in low and income countries. And I think as we're thinking about how to improve efficiency so we can bring down costs and reduce environmental burdens with respect to animal source foods, to also really pay attention to the incredibly important role of being sure that we're doing this in a way that also brings into rural development, that we're not going so macro, so commercial, so at such a high level that we forget the important role of increasing incomes in these populations. Bring down costs, but we've got to increase incomes as well. It's not enough to make these foods available, we've got to make them accessible, and that has to come through also income generation. And not forgetting, obviously, the world's becoming more and more and more urban, including Africa, Latin America, certainly, as well as Asia. And then I would also emphasize the important role of gender in all of this, particularly if we look at poultry production at a small scale. Women tend to really be involved in that much more than men, and the role that this has for their own empowerment. We know that the more access to resources women have, the better nourished their children are. And so this is also very important for child nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeffrey?
Thanks. I I think it's been well said all the way up and down the table. I don't have a lot to add, but I would say that we can't be hesitant. We can't be, I guess, sort of backseaters in terms of our communication about the importance of animal source foods beyond sort of dietary requirements even, but just, as you said, to development in many countries. So I would encourage everyone to think about that, and think about that in the context of a brief conversation with the person next to them on the airplane or wherever they'd have the opportunity to influence someone about the importance of animal source foods in the diet. I like to think of it as, you know, without animal source foods, you know, we can create a diet that will fully support life, but with animal source foods, we can live more fully.
Thank you very much. In closing remark from me, I guess this morning Berhad Takola shared with us the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular FAO's focus on Goal 1 and 2 being to end poverty and end hunger. And I think it's fair to say, and Chessie, you mentioned it, as did some others, that, you know, if we don't address these two issues together, then we're not going to find a solution. So they are inextricably linked, both hunger and poverty. We're going to go to a break now, but before we do, please again join me in thanking our panelists for their time this morning.